Welcome, Cam. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I'm really fascinated by your experience and background and your expertise in marketing, particularly obviously to the fintech sector. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your overview of it all.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Pamela. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So I'm the founder, as you said, of a communications consultancy that's dedicated to finance and fintech sector, ConnectCommS. So I'm based in London, and we operate globally. Most of our clients are either incumbent businesses in financial services, so for example, investment banking, capital markets, asset management firms, but also fintech new entrants, right? So companies disrupting various aspects of these markets with new and exciting ways of doing business. So we kind of see both sides of the equation, and very much what I see is both competition and collaboration between big banks, big tech, and fintech. So it's an interesting space in that regard.
Well, I did spend a couple of years in London before I went to Silicon Valley, so it's quite a few years ago. But obviously, London was much more ahead, which I was surprised by. I've been following Bitcoin since I had a business in Ireland in 2008, and it was much slower in the US when I got there in Silicon Valley. So obviously, you guys have had a longer overview of the fintech market. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? What you've seen over the years?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting point, Pemo. I mean, obviously we're seeing the digitalization of financial products and markets, everywhere around the world. I think the industry now is facing very much this sort of once in a generational societal and market disruptions that's kind of, amongst other things, blurring the lines between traditional finance and fintechs. As I mentioned, a lot of sort of competition and collaboration. And the evolution has been interesting. I mean, to your point, some of the activity now in Europe is, I mean, has been quite well established, especially in London. There's a number of different sort of fintech hubs, obviously, in Europe. I mean, London is a leading hub. And to your point about it being a little bit ahead of the curve, sort of historically, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that London has a position as an established global financial center, right? So it's obviously been around for a long time as a financial center, and the way in which obviously Silicon Valley, is a bit different.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, and there's an interesting blend of obviously historical, deeply established finance talent, but also tech talent and STEM talent as well.
And in those days when I was in London, there wasn't a lot of tech talent, or well, particularly women tech talent. And I was pitching for venture, and it was like being in a wasteland, really. It was a long time ago, and I'm really, really encouraged to see all so much happening now in the UK, but also in Europe. So that's fantastic. And so, would you like to talk a little bit about the differences, how you guys approach the markets, the financial markets, both in Europe and, well, actually, on that point, what has the ramifications of Brexit been for you guys
Yeah, I mean,
with the
it's been
finance?
yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, I think that sort of we live in interesting times, to
Yes.
say the least. But in some ways, in terms of the big mega trends, it feels a little bit sort of forgotten about to some extent, because you had Brexit, and then of course you've had the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's
Yeah.
been lots of these sort of kind of negative or at least disruptive things going on recently. And I talked a bit about at least in Europe, London, where I'm based, being probably the premier fintech hub, and it has a very strong leadership position compared to other European fintech centers. But that's not to be taken for granted, and there are threats, and obviously one of those threats are the negative implications, or at least negative perceptions of Brexit. In the financial markets in particular, losing the right to passport with the EU markets. In other words, being able to just work seamlessly with European markets, which we're not able to any longer. So that's a real threat. And I
Right.
think the other threat to London as a sort of big centre is just the growing competition from rival jurisdictions, and there are quite a few of those rival jurisdictions beyond London across Europe.
Mm. So interesting. Thanks for that feedback. And so, what I was going to ask was, can you talk a little bit about the differences in marketing, Europe now, the UK, and the US, and Asia? Asia also was a booming, thriving fintech market much before Silicon Valley.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I'm a little bit less familiar with Asia, but certainly
Right.
I've worked extensively in Europe and the US. And there are some interesting differences between US and European marketing, communications, community building in fintech, which ultimately reflect the wider differences in how fintechs and techs are managed in the US versus Europe. So for example, I think in Europe there's a bit more of a it's changing, but it's a bit more of a revenue first rather than growth first approach. So in the US, startups traditionally have this big reliance on VC funding and heavy marketing budgets and a focus on growth at all costs and obtaining as many users as possible and move fast and break things and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's obviously, at least historically, certainly more accessible funding options in other parts of the world. So there's less of a, this is not best practice, of course, but there's less of a focus on establishing steady cash flow, until a bit later on compared to Europe, where, comparatively fewer later stage funding opportunities. So businesses have to get very revenue oriented. Otherwise, they just can't survive. And the upside of this, I think, as European founders, have an opportunity to be more autonomous, they have less equity dilution, and then by generating revenue early on, that's obviously the best proof that there's an actual product market fit for their business. And I'd also just say that there's also more of what I would call a sequential go-to-market strategy in Europe versus the US, just because it can be slower to grow in Europe because of all the diversity of all the different European markets. Right, there's so much localization. These are 20 plus different states and different jurisdictions. So you have to translate all your products into several languages, or you have to,
Right.
if you're doing media, it's obviously not just English speaking media like it is in the US. It's many different kinds of media. You have to build partnerships in different countries, and that just means it has to be more of a sequential go-to-market approach, which again can have an upside because it can get firms or businesses more focused on achieving product market fit as a business in their own domestic market before expanding to other countries. So all these differences then just to kind of start to feed through into how tech companies and fintech companies market and communicate themselves.
And now the other thing I noticed in Silicon Valley was that there's a big difference in the finance markets in New York compared to Silicon Valley. And obviously that market in New York is older, like London. So what's your perspective on that, on the New York financial market and fintech there?
Yeah, it's obviously a very strong market. There's it's a strong public markets there. There's a strong private capital. I think in some ways it's more similar to London than it is to Silicon Valley because you have the deeply established financial business there as well as VC funding, which you also see in London, but it's just obviously on a much larger scale in New York.
One of the bonuses of the US is they have their own massive market. And obviously, the downfall, as you've just pointed out, is that there is a strong focus on um, and reliance on venture capital, and there are pitfalls to that because there's a lot of startups that die, maybe too early for the market. The forerunners of a trend that comes later. Um, but obviously in Europe, you have, as you said, you have to cater to so many jurisdictions or countries, and I'm sure there's a bonus to that in the sense of building a strong company and a sense of more globalization than possibly there is in the US. That's just a question. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of area. I think if you look at globalization and sort of some of the longer term economic and demographic trends, you can see all the trends moving in the direction of actually of Africa ultimately, and sort of South Asia. And I think that Europe, with its sort of many different cultures in some ways, and different kind of countries in some ways, is a bit more linked into the wider demographic piece. So I think if you think about founders and investors and businesses kind of looking ahead 10 years, they're likely to be looking a lot towards, as I said, Africa and Southeast and South Asia, rather than the kind of focus we have now, which is obviously US, Western Europe, China, Southeast Asia. So that's a little bit different. Whereas the US is obviously a huge market, and there's so much diversity within the US, but it feels like it's a bit of a world apart from the rest of the world in
Yeah,
that sense.
yeah. And obviously, the interesting thing about Africa, particularly, is that people basically are unbanked. A lot of people unbanked, and um, a lot of great innovation comes out of that because people have to survive. And that being right on the rubber on the road, I guess. Definitely some incredible creative opportunities, and I'm noticing a lot of fintech companies in Africa being funded in Silicon Valley now. So that's really a
Interesting. Yeah.
big leap that wasn't happening a while back.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think if you look at the sort of big fintech centers, beyond London in the rest of the EMEA region, so Europe,
Yeah.
Middle East, and Africa, some of the most interesting developments, are in Africa. For example, obviously Nigeria is a big hitter. So Lagos in Nigeria is one of the biggest African fintech hubs. There's a real boom there, driven by rising adoption of financial services. Relatively young population, digital natives. You have nearly half of the population. I mean, 200 million people, population of Nigeria. Nearly half of that population have bank accounts, but 2/3 of adults, I think, have mobile phones. So to your point, they're really interested in a lot of these sort of mobile services or electronic money transfers, as well as savings and investment products. So I think
Yeah.
that's a really positive story in Africa. And then the other kind of big hub in Africa I would sort of single out is Kigali in Rwanda, which is obviously very different to Nigeria in terms of population and size of the economy. But Rwanda has made some significant inroads in promoting fintech, and in fact, this wider economy, which is transforming a lot. It's often called the Singapore of Africa.
Mm.
And you're seeing them implement a number of regulatory and industry efforts to promote fintech, including innovation communities created by the government and the private sector, and indeed a sandbox regulatory framework for fintech. So that's also very interesting.
Mm. And of course, we have to talk about crypto and blockchain. I was wondering what your perspectives on that, or your overview, because obviously you're in an incredible seat as far as the whole global situation goes.
Yeah, no, I think that whole wave is really interesting. I mean, if you think about it in terms of, Web 2.0 and crypto and NFTs and DeFi and, DAOs and all this kind of stuff, I mean, the whole kind of move to sort of decentralized finance is really interesting. And I think there's so many different elements to unpack. But,
Mm,
as a marketer and a communicator, if I look at it from that angle, I think it's, if you think about crypto as being, essentially a system that's decentralized, there's no sort of intermediaries, it sort of changes the way you market and communicate. It's arguably less about, historically in B2B finance, it's all about building credibility and confidence in people, which obviously actually ironically is a big issue, obviously, of crypto, but it's about doing that of certain intermediaries. But, now I think with, decentralized finance, if those intermediaries are being removed, it changes the whole way you market and communicate. So you do it through communities more, for example, than you did before. So it just changes the shape of things.
got it. Got it. And what's so interesting also is the froth that seems to have happened. Excuse my adjective, uh, particularly since the COVID lockdown started in 2020. What's your understanding of that? Why has this all happened? And it does seem to be settling with the crypto prices dropping and not being so speculative, because I've always seen Bitcoin as a store of value, but of course it's been more of a gamble in the last few years. What's your perspective on this whole big sea change that's happened while the crisis has been going on.
Yeah, I think it's just it's a it's a complex question. I think it's kind of linked into some of the wider societal kind of changes I alluded to at the beginning, and people the kind of confidence or faith people have or don't have, and sort of
Mm.
decentralized systems, and to your point, looking for an alternative store of value, which is obviously a challenge now for crypto, given how sort of volatile the price is. I guess there's like almost like a checklist of currencies, the sort of the means of exchange part and the unit of account. It's hard to use it as unit of account as well, obviously, given the fluctuations. But it's just a space I think we have to watch to see. And I think the other part of it is just regulation to see how that pans out, in the EU and in the US and Asia.
And how's it looking? How's that looking in the UK? I don't hear much about that. Obviously, I'm more focused on the US regulation with the SEC, but how's that looking? Are the financial establishments feeling threatened, or are they taking it on board? The whole crypto, Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think it's just moved very, very fast in the last sort of year or so. I think there was a time where the big incumbent financial institutions were just very resistant or just very sort of skeptical. But they've all, I think, the last year or so, or even the last few months, they're all making moves,
Oh, good.
towards crypto and also just the wider space, including just Web 3.0 generally, the metaverse. I saw that JP Morgan became the first bank to establish a presence on the metaverse. So it just feels like it's all evolving very fast.
Right. Yeah, it's accelerated a lot of things, correct? And
Well,
I guess
absolutely.
I guess people's focus has been different with all the lockdowns and the stringent conditions that people have lived under for so long. So I guess it's not surprising that other stuff would happen. My last question, I'm sorry to take so long, but you're very interesting with this global perspective. Uh, what's your thoughts about the NFT craze? It seems like millions can be made and millions can be stolen, from what my viewpoint.
Well, that's a great question. I'm by no means an expert on NFTs. I just think it's just really interesting, especially how it's sort of playing out in the art world,
Yeah.
which because obviously London's a big center for the art industry.
Mm.
But I think it just remains to be seen. I think I really do see it as part of that kind of wider kind of decentralized finance, and it just poses questions, I think, for marketers and communicators, and for how they if you're representing an NFT business or any kind of sort of Web 3.0 business, how do you explain that to stakeholders? How do you make a strong case for it? How do you make it believable and credible? I think communications will play an important role in that transition.
I agree. And obviously, it's the interface between innovation and more established society and communities. So fabulous talking to you, Cam. You've enlightened me quite a bit, and I really appreciate it. And I'm sure my listeners will really enjoy this conversation. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, Pema. Thanks for having me. It was great. It was great chatting to you.
Okay.